I used to think the worst pain a mother could feel was childbirth. That scream of the body tearing itself open, the blood, the shaking, the unearthly exhaustion. Then the flood of warmth when you hold your baby for the first time. That's what I thought pain was. But I was wrong. Real pain isn't physical. Real pain is watching your child look at you with fear in her eyes because someone else, someone cruel, vindictive, and manipulative, has poisoned her mind against you. Real pain is hearing a judge slam a gavel and call you a criminal for loving the very person you brought into the world. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I was accused of kidnapping my own daughter. That Friday morning had started beautifully. I remember it with aching clarity because it was the last normal morning of my life. The air had the crisp bite of autumn, the trees dressed in blazing orange and red, their leaves crunching underfoot. I had picked out Lily's little denim jacket, the one with the butterfly patches she insisted on sewing herself. She twirled in it like a dancer, her brown curls bouncing. "Mommy, we'll get hot chocolate too, right?" she asked, clutching her backpack straps. "Of course," I said, smiling. "It's tradition." Our weekend was supposed to be perfect. I had planned a trip to my parents' cabin by the lake. Just me and Lily. Fishing, marshmallows by the fire, maybe even letting her stay up late to watch the stars. She was 6, at that age where everything feels like magic. I kissed her forehead before school and promised, "I'll be waiting right here when the bell rings." And I was. At 3:15 sharp, she came running into my arms, her little face glowing. The kind of moment mothers live for. I buckled her into the back seat, turned up her favorite silly pop songs, and we drove off singing together. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing at all. But by nightfall the world came crashing down. It was around 8:30 p.m. Lily was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, eating popcorn while we watched a Disney movie. I remember stroking her hair, feeling her safe, warm weight against me. That's when the knock came. It wasn't gentle. It was violent. Ring, ring, ring. "Open up. Police." My heart stuttered. For a split second I thought they had the wrong house. I hadn't done anything wrong. Why would the police be here? I opened the door to 3 officers standing in the porch light. Their hands hovered near their belts. Behind them, red and blue lights from a squad car splashed across my yard. "Evelyn Carter?" one of them asked. "Yes." My voice cracked. "We have a report that you are unlawfully detaining a child." "What?" I blinked at him, confused. "That's my daughter. She's right here. Look, Lily, come say hi." Lily peeked from behind me, clutching my sweater. The officer's gaze hardened. "Ma'am, we received a kidnapping report from the child's father, Daniel Carter. He has full custody. You're in violation of court orders." The words stabbed into me like ice. "That's not true," I snapped. "I have visitation rights. I picked her up from school, legally. Check the papers." But they didn't care. They had already stepped inside, already moving toward my daughter. Lily screamed when one officer reached for her. "No. Mommy." She clung to me, her tiny hands digging into my shirt. I wrapped my arms around her. "You're not taking her. This is a mistake. Call my lawyer, call the school. They'll tell you." But my words were drowned by orders. Rough hands yanked me back. Another officer lifted Lily, who kicked and cried, her voice shredding my heart. "Mommy! Mommy!" Her scream was the last sound I heard before the door slammed and the squad car carried her away. They arrested me. Like a criminal. I sat under buzzing fluorescent lights in a police station, the smell of sweat and disinfectant burning my nose. They took my fingerprints. They snapped my mugshot while I stood there, hollow-eyed in shock. The detective assigned to my case was a square-jawed man with tired eyes. He shoved papers at me. "Daniel Carter has provided documents showing you don't have visitation rights. He claims you forged signatures in the past. He says you're unstable." "That's a lie," cried. "He's lying. He always lies. He manipulated me through our entire marriage, and now he's doing it again. Please, you have to believe me." But my pleas bounced off him like pebbles against a wall. By midnight I was in a holding cell. Cold metal bench. concrete walls. The sound of other women groaning or cursing in their own misery. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. All I saw were Lily's eyes wet with tears as they dragged her from me. The trial came weeks later. Daniel stood there in a suit, crocodile tears streaming down his cheeks as he told the court I was a danger to my own child. "She's obsessed," he said, voice breaking with false emotion. "Evelyn doesn't know boundaries. She took Lily without my permission, despite the clear ruling. I'm scared for my daughter's safety." The judge looked at me like I was dirt. I wanted to scream, to tear the lies apart, to tell the court about the years of manipulation, the way Daniel had slowly cut me off from friends, from opportunities, from money, until leaving him felt like escaping a prison. But my lawyer whispered, "Stay calm. Let me handle it." Calm. How could I stay calm while the man who had tormented me stood there, painting me as a monster? And then the verdict came. Custody stripped. My visitation rights revoked. And because of the false accusation, my name was added to a list of potential abductors. I walked out of that courtroom a ghost. Weeks turned into months. I was shunned. Parents at Lily's school whispered when I walked by. Neighbors looked at me with suspicion. Friends stopped calling. Everywhere I went, I was that woman, the kidnapper mother. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was Lily. When I finally saw her during a supervised visit, she wouldn't look at me. Daniel had poisoned her. "Daddy said you tried to steal me," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "No, baby," I said, fighting back tears. "I would never steal you. Mine. You're my heart." But the damage was done. She flinched when I reached out to touch her hand. Something inside me broke that day. Not the kind of break that leaves you shattered on the floor. No, this was different. This was the kind of break that hardens you, that fills the cracks with molten fury. I realized then, Daniel had taken everything from me. My reputation, my freedom, my daughter's love. And he thought he'd won. But he didn't know me as well as he thought. Because I wasn't going to beg anymore. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to make him pay. And I would take back my daughter no matter what it cost. When they closed the courtroom doors behind me and handed Lily to Daniel, I felt as if my bones had been hollowed out. What I didn't realize then was that the hollow would fill with something hotter, heavier than grief. It would harden into a single, terrible instrument. Purpose. This is how it began. Chapter 1: The Quiet Before the Storm. The first weeks after the verdict were a strange rehearsal in silence. I went through the motions society still allowed me. Supervised visits, required counseling sessions I had to sign up for as part of rehabilitation, paper forms to fill out, mandatory check-ins with a caseworker who treated me as if I were a ticking time bomb. Everyone seemed to want to keep the world orderly. Neatly labeled boxes that read accused, restricted, dangerous. I lived in those boxes. But behind that enforced normalcy, I was learning to read the map of my new life. Revenge, I decided, was not a lightning strike. It was a chisel. You find the seam in the rock and you chip away, day after patient day, until the thing you want is revealed. The first step was to understand Daniel, to map his lies, and to find the places where they did not hold up to scrutiny. He had been meticulous in the courtroom. He had planted the seeds, documents, testimony, a narrative of me as erratic and deceitful. The judge had seen enough evidence, or been persuaded enough to tip the scale. But every lie needs scaffolding. People who lie for you, records that can be forged, an ugly little industry of plausible deniability. My job was to watch the scaffolding and figure out which plank would make the whole structure collapse. So I started collecting. Chapter 2. Allies I didn't know I had. If there was one mercy, it was that Daniel's campaign to make me disappear had been loud enough to attract attention. Not from friends, I had lost most of them, but from people I had never noticed before. A woman at the grocery store who used to watch us at soccer practice. A cleaner at the kindergarten who gave me a small, steady look that said, "I remember." An old neighbor who once mowed our lawn and now slipped an envelope under my door with handshaking handwriting. Inside the envelope were photos. An old birthday party where Daniel stood in the background with a face that didn't belong to someone who loved children. A snapshot of a night out where his hand was on another woman's back. Little things. But when you've been reduced to nothing, even little things can be a spark. There were emails too. A name, Marco S. He used to work at Daniel's firm. Someone thought Marco would talk. I hired a private investigator. His name was Harris Lane. He was not glamorous. He wore the same battered leather jacket in every photo I saw, and he had the kind of voice that didn't ask questions so much as recorded them like homework. When he looked at me across his cluttered desk, he said quietly, "You got stones, kid." "Why now?" "Because I have to get my child back," I said. I could barely keep my voice steady. "Because he took everything from me." Harris didn't ask me for a quid pro quo. He asked for the truth. For specifics. For money. I gave him both. The money came from the last of my savings and a loan from my sister. She still believed in me. The specifics came from a place inside me where memories were filed like reports. Dates Daniel had disappeared on the weekends, a pattern of late-night calls, the times he had been at work, that coincided with lavish purchases on his credit card. Harris started where I couldn't, where an outsider with no stake could, the records. Chapter 3: Paper Cuts. Legal systems are paper machines. There are forms, signatures, timestamps, little holes where truth and fiction can be threaded, and if you pull the right thread, the fabric loosens. Harris filed requests. He asked for school pickup logs, for bus manifests, for phone metadata. He sent a polite letter to the judge asking for transcripts and clarifications on the documents Daniel had presented. He subpoenaed receipts from restaurants, and he asked my ex-husband's law firm for billing statements. They refused. I expected that. Waiting for paper is its own kind of torture. You invent scenarios to fill the silence. I would lie awake at night and imagine Daniel slipping, a tell revealing the lie. I pictured a receipt with a wrong date, a name spelled wrong. I imagined childish, desperate fantasies, that justice could simply fall into my lap. Real life does not hand you fantasies. It gives you cold emails, request denied, records unavailable, privileged. But sometimes it gives you a slope. An angle where two minor inconsistencies meet. Harris found one. Chapter 4: The First Crack. It was small. Typo. Daniel had submitted an email to the court. An email that, on its surface, proved he had made arrangements advising the school about custody changes weeks before I had taken Lily that day. The email was presented as evidence that Daniel had withdrawn my visitation privileges. It was presented as proof I had knowingly violated a custody order. Harris read the header and then read it again. The timestamp was legitimate, but the sender was odd. A comma in the wrong place. An internal code for the school's administration that did not match the format they used. The email traced back to a server that, if you looked at the network logs, showed a relay point in a cafe 2 blocks from Daniel's office. Not conclusive, yet just a slivered doubt. We dug deeper. The cafe's Wi-Fi logs. Harris used legitimate channels to request them. Showed a device connecting at the time the email had been sent. The device registered as D. Carter phone. It was the kind of thing a careless person would leave as a setting, the kind of small arrogance men like Daniel had. A device labeled by themselves. But the device belonged to Daniel. Or did someone put the label there? Harris traced purchase receipts near that time. A battered prepaid phone purchased by a man matching Daniel's description. Minutes purchased in cash, a paper trail that stopped when the cash started. It smelled like orchestration, like someone had planned a trail to look like Daniel but had missed a stitch. Seeing the first crack was intoxicating. It meant the scaffold was not monolithic. It meant, dangerously, that the story that had been sown might unravel. Chapter 5: The Edge of the Knife. When you start cutting at a lie, you have to be careful of the blood. Not because the blood is important, but because it stains you. I crossed lines I had thought I never would. I sat in my car outside Daniel's office and watched the way his assistant slid him a stack of papers. I followed a woman in a gray coat to a boutique 2 neighborhoods away, noting the way she smiled at him. I sat in pews and watched him at church, the practiced grief of a man who wanted the world to think him broken. I took photographs, notes, recordings where legal, always careful to document, not to entrap. There is nothing noble about obsession. It is, at its root, a series of choices. And I chose one after another. The first choices were small. A late-night phone call to an anonymous tip line. A letter slipped into a file at Lily's school asking that they re-examine the sign-in logs from the day I picked her up. The school called. They told me politely that they had rechecked and that nothing untoward showed up. Then, 3 days later, an administrator called back with a softer voice. We found an undated note in our visitor log. Someone wrote, "Check Miller's column." Miller was the name of the aide who volunteered at pickup duty. The note led to his desk, which led to a shoebox full of unsent parent emails, some that should have been logged and weren't. Miller was frightened. He told me he remembered a man, Daniel, who sometimes lingered near the gate and spoke sharply to parents who questioned him. He said he'd been told by a supervisor to forget what he'd seen, because it would make things complicated. Miller became our witness. Chapter 6, The Slew of Trials. Harris and I started to form a choreography. Legal requests, small interviews, a pattern that could be presented to someone who could act. We were not yet at the point where the court would reopen my case. We were at the point where the court could be convinced enough to look again. But convincing a court to reopen requires authority, an attorney with courage and a judge with patience. Lawyers cost money. Courage is in short supply. I found a lawyer, not the flashy kind on billboards, but a woman named Priya Shah who took cases that smelled like injustice and didn't care much about the PR. Priya was razor sharp and had the kind of righteous impatience I could feed on. She said without ceremony, "We have to show a pattern of fabrication. One typo doesn't do that." She was right. She said we needed at least 3 threads that pointed to orchestration. So we kept digging. We subpoenaed Daniel's communications around the time of the withdrawal email. We asked for phone logs, for IP access, for calendar appointments. Daniel's legal team called it harassment. The judge called some of our requests invasive. The legal grind was tedious and slow and, to my everlasting shame, expensive. But we found things. A chain of bank transfers from one of Daniel's shell companies to a consulting firm that had no staff. An entity whose invoices were suspiciously vague. A babysitter who swore under oath that Daniel had been late for pickups and sometimes unreachable. A pattern the court had dismissed as minor. A woman who came forward, reluctant but shaking, saying she had seen Daniel changing documents on his laptop in a cafe the month before the custody hearing. She described the same coffee-stained table Harris had traced the relay through. Every new detail was not, on its own, a brick to topple the wall. But each was a hairline fracture. Together they formed a map. Chapter 7, The Public Rip. If the system wouldn't move faster, we would make it move. In one of our last gambits that year, Priya arranged an interview with a local investigative journalist named Aaron Klein. He had a reputation for being fair but unsparing, for preferring documentation to melodrama. I sat in a small windowless cafe with Aaron and spilled my story like a confession, except every claim I made I could substantiate. I showed him the school photos, the typos, the transaction receipts. I gave him Miller's account. I showed him a printout of the cafe Wi-Fi log that Harris had procured through proper channels. I handed him phone metadata and the battered receipt for a prepaid device. Aaron listened like a man building a puzzle. When he left that day, he said simply, "If any of this checks out, this isn't just a family story. It's corruption." The article ran 2 weeks later. A feature with crisp writing and no sensationalism. Aaron had done what journalists do best, taken the facts and arranged them under a light that made them impossible to ignore. He pointed to discrepancies, asked why the school's log had been altered, and quoted an expert on digital forgery who said the relay pattern suggested a second-hand operation. The piece made the rounds. Someone from City Hall called. A local TV station asked for a statement. My phone, long a desert, began to buzz with messages. Not much of it was kindness, and a good chunk was schadenfreude masquerading as curiosity, but there were other notes too. A man who used to be in Daniel's book club and had a name on his tongue but needed anonymity. A mother who had had a similar experience and had lost custody because she'd been too emotional in court. The tide had not turned, but it had shifted its angle. The scaffolding that Daniel had built to prop up his story was now visible to strangers. Once a story touches strangers, it becomes harder to sustain. Chapter 8. The Price of Flame. There is a cost to any fire you start. Ours was swift and severe. Daniel retaliated. He filed an emergency motion claiming harassment and seeking a no-contact order. His attorneys called Priya and threatened to file counterclaims for defamation. Anonymous threats started landing in my inbox, the sort that make you take the locks more seriously and align your keys under the mat like a ritual. He hired a firm to dig into my past and dress it up as evidence of instability. Old mistakes, some mine, some blown out of proportion, were dredged up and paraded as proof I was unfit. A crockpot of social media came to a slow boil. Strangers who had never met me offered opinions as if they'd been in the courtroom. People who had whispered in grocery aisles now yelled across comment threads. It's astonishing how quickly the world chooses a side and then refuses new facts. But there were also people who reached out with small, practical kindnesses. A therapist who offered sliding scale sessions, a cousin who slept on my couch so I wouldn't be alone, Lily's teacher who slipped a note to Harris that said, "Keep going." Harris kept going. He found Marco S., the man who'd worked at Daniel's firm. Marco was careful at first. He'd seen what happens to people who speak up. But he had guilt under his skin, and guilt has a way of turning into a weapon against your own conscience. He told us that there had been meetings wherein narratives were shaped, wherein certain documents were arranged to support Daniel's story. He produced emails with vague language and drafts with different headers, enough to show intent. When you stitch enough small inconsistencies together, the picture you thought you were seeing, of an ironclad case, starts to look like an elaborate stage set. The judge noticed. The press noticed. Daniel noticed. And his jaw tightened in a way I had never seen before. Chapter 9. A Night of Cold Rain. There was a night when everything felt like it would collapse. It rained and the wind pushed at the windows like a fist. I had a supervised visit scheduled for the next morning. I lay awake thinking of small cruelties. How Daniel had taught Lily to say "Daddy's home" with pride and "Mommy made a mistake" with a tremor. I wondered what Lily thought when I left and what words she told herself at night to explain why I had been taken away. I dreamed of taking her back in my arms and never letting go. I dreamed of a courtroom where Daniel's face was exposed and the judge apologized. I rose in the gray hours of the morning and made coffee as if habit could steady me. That morning Lily refused to meet me. Her teacher said she'd had a tantrum at breakfast and clung to Daniel until he promised something. Money? A trip? I didn't know. I sat in the visitation room and watched the door, feeling like a foreigner. When she finally entered, she wouldn't look at me. She stared at her shoes and traced the seam of the chair with a finger. "Hi, baby," I said. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else. "How's school?" She mumbled something about spelling tests. She ate a cookie mechanically. The clock moved in an unforgiving circle. When the session ended, she hugged me briefly and then pulled away. Her eyes said, "I'm supposed to be afraid." Mine said, "I will fix this." I left that room and for the first time in a long time, I let myself cry full-throated in the rain. The drops mingled with my tears and for a moment it felt like baptism, not a washing but a claiming. Grief had done its worst. Something harder had come in its wake. Chapter 10. The Line We Crossed. Ticking away in my chest was a knowledge that we were close. The fabric of Daniel's story had holes, and if you pressed them, they gaped. There were still risks. There were still things we couldn't prove without a subpoena and a judge's nod. We were bending the law's rules to our advantage, but we were not breaking them. Not yet. Priya prepared a motion for rehearing. She argued bias, she argued newly discovered evidence, and she argued that the communications presented at the original hearing had been manipulated. It is a long legal ritual. We would sit in rooms that smelled of dust and paper while the world waited like a jury. When the motion was filed, Daniel did what men like him do. He doubled down. He put on a show of righteous indignation and legal muscle. I felt smaller in the face of that. But I also felt something else. The old fear that had haunted me for years was now sharp with purpose. Fear had been my constant companion under Daniel's thumb. Now fear rearranged itself into a tool. We waited for the hearing date like a patient waiting for a wound to scab. We prepared exhibits. We rehearsed testimony. People who had been silent. Miller, Marco, the babysitter, agreed to speak. Aaron's article had rattled a few loose teeth. The city prosecutor called to say they were monitoring the matter. The night before the hearing, I stood at Lily's window and watched the street lamps spill light over the wet pavement. I practiced what I might say if called upon. I rehearsed the look I would give Daniel when our eyes met across a courtroom. Not rage, not pleading, but a steady need that could not be denied. I was no longer a woman waiting to be rescued. I was a woman who had decided to reach for her daughter, with whatever legal fingers she had. Chapter 11: The Hearing. The courtroom smelled the same as always. Polished wood, varnish, the faint perfume of people who think themselves morally pure. Daniel sat across the aisle, white-knuckled. His lawyer's face was a practiced mask of confidence. Priya presented our case like a surgeon. She showed the email headers. She brought in Miller, who described the unsent notes he'd found. Marco testified, hands trembling, that narratives were discussed in Daniel's firm. How to frame things so the judge would see a concerned father, not a manipulator. It was not dramatic television. It was meticulous. At one point, Daniel leaned forward and whispered something so venomous his voice slipped into a tone I recognized from our marriage. "You'll lose everything for this." His words were meant to intimidate, but this time they landed on glass. They did not crack me. When the judge asked a question about the emails chain and the relay point, she paused and then asked to see the digital logs. The prosecution had never subpoenaed them before. Now they were there, laid bare. The logs showed the relay through the cafe. The cafe's attendant testified he'd seen Daniel with a laptop that week. Partners joked, not witness testimony, but still. By the end, the judge announced a limited reopening of evidence. She would allow a forensic audit of the supposed withdrawal emails and a review of the school's logs. It wasn't a triumph. It was a chance. But chances are the scaffolding's worst enemy. Once a structure is exposed to the air, rain gets in. Wind comes. Termites find the wood. We had wind now. Chapter 12: The Taste of Something Sharper. The forensic audit took time, but its conclusion was a small, terrible thing. The email chain had been tampered with. Metadata didn't match. Annotations suggested edits. The audit did not say who had done it, but it said the email could not be relied upon as evidence of legitimate withdrawal of visitation. Daniel's legal team called it a stretch. They said the audit was inconclusive. The public, however, smelled the scent of scandal. There were murmurs and late-night hosts and someone who had once served as a juror posting a picture of a gavel on social media with the caption, "Keep watching." One night, after a long day in court, I received a small package left anonymously on my doorstep. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "For Lily." My heart stuttered. I almost threw it away. I almost called the police. But curiosity is its own assassin. I took it to Harris. We plugged it into a lockdown machine. Video files. A man's voice, Daniel's, on a recording discussing arranging documents and securing the narrative. It was not a smoking gun. Voices can be doctored. But the voice's cadence was Daniel's and the content was specific. Dates, names, and an instruction to create an email trail. I am not proud of what I felt as I watched that footage. It was vindication, sweet and bitter. It was also a moral gray area. How had someone obtained that recording? Who had recorded it? The note "for Lily" meant someone wanted me to have it. Someone was giving me a weapon. I felt the tug of temptation to use it immediately, to release it to journalists, to make Daniel feel the public burn. Priya counseled caution. We could not use an unlawfully obtained recording in court without consequence. We had to authenticate its origins. But even if the recording didn't stand as evidence, it could damage Daniel publicly. Aaron wanted it. He called it the story of the year. Chose to be patient. Not because I judge myself suddenly noble, but because I had learned the hard lesson that matters most. Expediency often eats victory for breakfast. 100 petty triumphs cannot replace one clean, irrevocable win. So we kept it. We let it haunt us. Chapter 13. The End of the Beginning. The hearing ended with neither exoneration nor final condemnation. The judge scheduled an evidentiary hearing, and the city prosecutor opened a preliminary inquiry into document tampering. The press stayed hot on the story. Social media subscribers doubled for Aaron's column. Daniel's smile, once effortless, began to look rehearsed. But most importantly, the world began to split. People stopped assuming the simple story that had been spoon-fed to them. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into interviews. Interviews turned into official processes. I had not yet gotten Lily back. There were still visits that felt like thefts, and there were still nights I wanted to curl into a ball and refuse the fight. There were also small, perfect moments. A text from Miller that read, "I'm sorry. I was scared. I'll be at the hearing." A voicemail from my sister saying, "We'll get her back, Evie. Step by step." And the way Priya would look at me as if daring me to stop. We had started the work of tearing the scaffolding down. The wall had hairline fractures now. The next part, the part one feared most, was breaking through the plaster and proving, beyond a reasonable doubt, what Daniel had done. The rain had washed the street clean. My reflection in the puddle looked strangely sure. I had been softened and then tempered. I had been hollowed and then filled with something that matched the hardness in Daniel's jaw. Only this hardness was not greed or cruelty. It was resolve. I slept that night like a person who has made a promise and intends to keep it. The first night after Lily was finally asleep in her little bed, safe under my roof again, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the shadows. My hands trembled as I gripped my mug. I wasn't sure if it was from relief, rage, or the exhaustion of fighting for years without pause. My little girl was home, but nothing was the same. I wanted to scream, to cry, to shatter every glass in the house. But instead I kept my calm. Because I knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Daniel had ruined me. He'd branded me a criminal, paraded me through courtrooms, whispered lies into Lily's ears, and stolen years I could never get back. Even now, as my daughter clung to me, I knew his shadow lingered, waiting to twist things again. I promised myself, this time I wouldn't just survive him. I would end him. Plan. Began slowly, quietly, carefully. Every night, after Lily fell asleep, I dug through the piles of documents my investigator and I had gathered. Bank statements, fraudulent custody filings, Daniel's shady business deals. It was a spiderweb of corruption. He had paid off lawyers, manipulated social workers, and even bribed a local cop to make me look guilty. But the best revenge wasn't just to prove my innocence. It was to expose his rot to the world. So I set my trap. I contacted a journalist I trusted, someone who had covered wrongful accusations before. At first, she didn't believe me. I had to push to show her every receipt, every forged signature, every text Daniel had drunkenly sent late at night where he boasted about destroying me. By the time I was done, she looked pale. This could blow up everything, she whispered. That's the point, I told her. The confrontation. It was a crisp winter morning when the article went live. Father's custody lies. The kidnapping blame that shattered a mother's life. Within hours, Daniel's empire of lies began to crumble. His neighbors whispered. His co-workers turned cold. And when the police knocked on his door this time, it wasn't to rescue Lily. It was to drag him away. But I didn't just leave it to the press. I wanted to look him in the eye. At the courthouse, where Daniel sat pale and sweating under questioning, I walked in with Lily holding my hand. He looked at us, and for once he wasn't smug. He wasn't victorious. He looked like a trapped animal. "You thought you could erase me," I said, my voice steady. "You thought you could rewrite my life, make me the villain in Lily's eyes. But look at us now." He opened his mouth, maybe to plead, maybe to lie again. But I didn't let him. You took everything from me. My name, my freedom, my child. Now it's your turn. The revenge fulfilled. The jury heard everything. His fraud, his manipulation, his bribes. By the end, there was no sympathy left for him. Daniel was sentenced, stripped of custody rights, and marked for what he truly was. A liar and a criminal. But revenge wasn't about watching him rot behind bars. Not entirely. It was about reclaiming my life. When I walked out of that courthouse with Lily's tiny hand in mine, I breathed in the cold air like it was the first real breath I'd taken in years. My daughter looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. "Mommy, are you really not a bad person?" she asked softly. I knelt down, tears burning my eyes. "No, baby. I never was. I was just blamed. But now you know the truth." She hugged me, clinging tighter than ever before. And in that moment, the fire inside me softened. I hadn't just won revenge. I had won back my child's trust. The ending. The scars will never fade. People still whisper. Some will always remember me as the mother who kidnapped her kid. But I don't care anymore. 'Cause Lily knows. And I know. Daniel tried to bury me under lies. But in the end, I rose from them stronger. And my revenge wasn't just his downfall. It was my resurrection. Sparkles the kidnapping blame, the end.